In the north of the Hunan province, Yuyang. Everyone looks at a strange man who is seated on the ground. According to the man, time passes like the wind and leaves nothing behind. He used to go on a rampage around the world, unafraid of anything. He demolished everything in the blink of an eye and murdered all opponents in his path, mocking the world, earning him the nickname of Ultimate Divine Demon. He was known as both the world's most wicked person and the world's strongest man. However, he was stopped by the 8 Immortals, a group of humans that protect the Central Plains. They were unable to slay him, so they sealed the ultimate divine demon, Dan Woohyun, in the lowest part of the Dongting Lake. In the end, 1,000 years had passed since Dan was frozen and imprisoned by the 8 Immortals. Even though the name 8 Immortals sounds majestic, they were just folks who had lost their wits to eating and playing around, and Dan voiced disbelief that he had been backstabbed by them but concluded that he was simply too weak. He walks down the street and realizes that people he knew are no longer around. After all, there can't possibly be any humans who have lived for 1,000 years. Dan had nowhere to go and nowhere to stay. He was simply following the clouds and the wind for the rest of his life. It's as though he's been apprehended by the ghost of his past. He wonders if he's changed much during his 1,000-year confinement. As he walks around, he notices a child on the floor. He wonders if the child is a beggar. He checked on her and noticed she still had a pulse. The child opens its eyes, which shocked Dan because he could notice a tiny similarity to her when he was a child. Dan told her she was incredibly blessed as he infused vitality into her, making her better. She would still require physical nutrition, so he offers her a pill that has been around for 1,000 years since there is no food nearby. The following morning, the youngster reappeared and offered him a dumpling as payment for treating her. Dan, on the other hand, refused her food and wondered how she had no fear or bloodlust for him. The next day, she reappeared, attempting to provide the dumpling, and the day after that, Dan ate the dumpling with the child. Dan ate the food that the youngster provided him every day for half a month. Dan was taken aback by the child's innocent and pure smile, but he didn't mind it. Dan walks down the street and hears a ruckus. The store owner was furious because the child kept taking his dumplings. He yelled and attacked the child, which made Dan understand that everything she provided him was stolen. He kicked the store owner's hand, breaking his entire fingers while the store owner screamed in pain. Dan became irritated as he remembered the time he spent with the child. He survived on the food she brought him but couldn't believe she stole it while being beaten up by others. As he wandered aimlessly, he realized he had arrived at the place that had imprisoned him for millennia, the Dongting Lake. He sees the child again, this time hiding in the bush as she claims to have located him. Dan wondered why she was following him around so closely when he had only helped her once. He inquired as to why she was searching for him. She claimed that she didn't want to be alone any longer, as Dan realized he was alone as well, as he ruled by himself, and it was such a lonely life, and it's still the same even after 1,000 years. Dan inquired about her name, and she replied, Hua Somi. He wonders if everything that is occurring to her is predestined and fated, and if she can build a situation where the current him is needed. He introduces himself to her and invites Somi to come with him. It was night when Dan decided to construct a home after realizing he had nowhere for them to stay. Somi wakes up in the morning and discovers a house. However, she stated that there was no house yesterday, to which Dan interrupted her to clarify that the house was there yesterday, but he simply fixed it up a little since it was a little run down. Somi couldn't believe it but recognized she was wrong because there was no reason for Dan to lie about it and no way such a nice-looking house would develop overnight. Dan was relieved that Somi loved it because he had put in a lot of work to create it. Dan was somewhat taken aback when she mentioned there were no fences. The fences arrived the next day, as Dan stated that they were there from the beginning, while Somi stated that she hadn't mentioned anything yet. However, she remarked that the house felt empty, and the next day, Somi was surprised to see a large tree and a pond. Dan discovered he still had a lot of things to make, such as a bed and other furnishings. He understood that having a hectic lifestyle isn't all bad. Dan stopped Somi with his finger as she was about to say something and began to build something. It was a pail in which Somi could bathe. Dan told Somi to stop running and stated he had acquired some clothes after selling a wild boar and some wood. He grabbed her while Somi replied that she was still clean and didn't need to wash up. Dan, on the other hand, ignored her pleas. Dan stated that Somi looked like a nice human after showering and questioned whether her clothes fit her. Somi commented that she had never worn such lovely clothing before and that it was stunning. However, she remarked that it didn't matter if the clothes didn't fit her, as she only wanted to be with him. Dan stated that she has kind words for someone so young and that it would be wonderful for them to live a tranquil life like this, while Somi smiled happily. However, two suspicious people were standing outside their residence while they were talking. There was a rumor going across Hunan province that there was a manor that arose near Dongting Lake. People said it was the work of a ghost, while Yuyong's magistrate, Hong Wenchang, wondered if the rumor was true, as someone claimed he couldn't confirm it but stated it was simply a rumor circulating about. Hong thought it was silly and said it was only a rumor but decided to have a look while taking a break. Hong and his men proceeded to inspect the manor at night. The guards are perplexed as to why Hong was upset, as it was just reported that several bandits stationed in the Hunan region had been terrorizing various communities in the area. In such case, the government wants to get rid of them as soon as possible, which explains why Hong is quite stressed about it. One of the guards questioned why no one was doing anything about the bandits if they were such horrible people. Someone said it was because of Jiang Baixin, the bandits' current leader. He possesses first-rate martial arts that most people would be unable to touch, as well as great horse-riding skills and the ability to flee when confronted with a martial master stronger than him. Because they couldn't apprehend him, the martial master decided to capture and behead his family members instead. However, someone informs Hong that because the imperial family is planning a large-scale extermination, he will have one less thing to worry about. Hong hopes that's the case, as he hasn't been able to rest in over a year. Hong's eyes widened when he discovered the manor was located near Dongting Lake. Some of the guards fell on their knees and begged forgiveness, fearful that it was the work of a ghost. Hong claimed that there was no such thing and that he would investigate the house. However, he suddenly sensed a strong bloodlust from behind him as he turned around and saw someone. Dan said that he had no recollection of inviting guests, but Hong suspected that the tremendous bloodlust was emanating from him and asked him if he was the owner of the manor. Dan informs him that he is, while Hong introduces himself as the Yuyong's magistrate, as everyone was pleased by Hong's cool demeanor. Hong inquired as to whether Dan had built it, to which Dan said that he had only renovated an abandoned house. Hong claimed that the land belonged to the country and that he could not build a house in an area where people are not permitted to live without permission. Dan, on the other hand, instructs him to merely grant him permission and then gives him a bunny to overlook the problem. Hong became outraged and informed everyone to capture Dan. Dan decided that it was preferable to observe rather than cause additional problems, and he was relieved that Somi was asleep. As they escorted Dan away, Hong reminded him that he had messed with the wrong person today and that he would not be let off easily. He said that he was mocked, who is the magistrate, and that it will not finish with flogging but could result in death. Hong had observed Dan's icy glare and wanted to get this over with as soon as possible. However, as they walked, Dan became aware that something was awry when a barrage of arrows was fired at them, killing all of the guards. Hong wondered who on earth did it, while someone called out his name and stated he was rather fearless, strolling around outside like that. He realized it was Jiang who had said his life was over. Hong recognized he'd made a mistake. It's been 6 months since Jiang's family was kidnapped and murdered. He didn't anticipate Jiang to be looking for him right now. Hong wondered if Dan would assist him, but quickly figured that he would not. Hong deemed that his sword was the only thing he could use as a weapon, but he realized that he couldn't win against dozens of them with it. Furthermore, he had to fight against the top martial artists commanded by Jiang. The bandits were eager to kill Hong as revenge for what he had done to their sister-in-law, and they also wanted to chop off Hong's limbs and feed them to the dogs. Hong begged for forgiveness, while Jiang stated that he had waited so long to hear it, and that there is no happier day than today. He longed to see more of Hong's terrified expression, but he couldn't because today was Hong's departure day to the other world. As the bandits took Hong away, they pondered what to do with Dan. Jiang then tells him he's lucky and sets him free. However, Dan asks Jiang to wait a moment as Jiang inquires if he was speaking to him. Dan inquired as to their plans for Hong. Jiang declared that he would kill him in the same way as he had slaughtered his family. However, Dan claimed that Jiang killed a large number of people, possibly more than Hong. He believed that Hong was only exacting vengeance on Jiang for the lives he had taken, which infuriated the bandits. However, Jiang stated what he would do about it, while Dan realized there were 50 bandits and asked Hong if he wanted to survive but only on the condition that he never cause any trouble with his manor again. Hong wondered if it was the manor he had just seen, while Dan said that it was a great offer. Hong tells him that if he is saved, he would do anything. When one of the bandits decided to attack Dan, he was sent flying and got knocked out. The bandits couldn't believe one of their strongest members had been defeated so quickly, while Jiang couldn't observe Dan's movement and wondered how he was captured by Hong. Jiang thought Dan was possibly stronger than him. However, he noted that if he is up against a large group of them, they may have a numerical advantage. He convinces himself that despite having battled countless martial masters, he has come a long way and that it would be fantastic if they could take Dan down in an instant. He informed everyone to kill Dan while all bandits were approaching to kill him. Dan had a brief thought about whether he should kill them or not, as it would be simple to do so. He could take them down with a single blow, but the prospect of having to pour blood again troubled him greatly. Dan closes his eyes as an explosion occurs when he has one of the bandits' necks in his grip. Everything came to a screeching halt when Jang witnessed something he couldn't believe. After the sword was thrown, it was struck with a stone that split into 100 shards and annihilated all his subordinates. Jang believed that a normal individual would have been unable to see that and questioned whether it was humanly conceivable to do that. He remarked that Dan was in a different league than all of the martial masters he had met thus far. He convinces himself not to think about vengeance and that if he takes even one step, he will be dead. Jang sprinted with all his strength the instant he realized what had happened. He left his fallen subordinates behind and moved his legs with all his power for the first time in his life. Dan wondered if Jang was fleeing and realized that his guts were much smaller than he had imagined. However, Hong urged Dan to capture Jang. Although Dan regards Hong as a terrible person and remarked that he dislikes going after someone who is fleeing, he had no choice but to assist Hong as the matter with his manner would be resolved. Dan quickly caught up to Jang, grabbing his head and smashing it to the ground. In the end, Hong awakens and realizes he's hanged from a tree branch. Dan informs him that their agreement is completed. He inquired of Hong whether he understood what he had just stated, to which Hong replied that he did. While Dan tried to warn him against picking a battle with his manner, Hong stopped him off by claiming that it would never happen again and that he should not worry about anything. Dan also told Hong not to talk about seeing him. He recalls what Somi said about attempting to smile when talking to others and how everyone would be terrified if he had such an emotionless face. He decided to smile and inform him that everything's good as long as he understands, while Hong realized that Dan is definitely a monster and tells himself that he would never go against him and do whatever he requested, and to never go near his manor or even come near the mountains ever again. Dan and Somi were walking down the streets of Yuyong's market in the north of Hunan province. She heard about the bandits being apprehended and that she was terrified as there were only 2 of them living in the forest. Dan asked if she was still nervous despite being with him, and she admitted she was a little nervous. As Somi was attracted by the fragrance of food, Dan thought that since the bandits had been apprehended, and Hong's problem with the mansion had been resolved. Somi was surprised to see such great food, and Dan realized that, more than anything else, he needs money to raise a child. Dan recalls that he could sleep anywhere and hunt whenever he wanted. He had been living like this since he was a child and had no notion how he should make money. He couldn't believe it was only now that he realized this. He decides to discover a way to make money as soon as possible. Somi began digging in the soil and declaring that she was almost finished, leaving Dan perplexed as to what she was doing out of nowhere. She requested that the flower be returned to her home and planted. Dan, on the other hand, inquired if she could do it as he felt the flower was well rooted. Somi asserted her strength and began to pull the blossom out. Dan saw that there were tracks that did not belong to them, and that the weeds around the bloom had recently been removed. Somi eventually succeeds in removing the flower, but it was accompanied by a strange pouch. As she attempted to open it to see what was inside, someone yelled, "How dare they touch other people's stuff," as the individual was going to attack Somi. Dan, on the other hand, manages to halt his assault and inquires as to who he is. The individual wonders why Dan was so powerful, as he was afterwards thrown flying and slammed to the ground. Somi passes out as Dan wonders if she was startled by what he had done to the individual. He was aware that someone had entered the area, but he had not expected the individual to attack Somi in such a manner. Dan assumed that if the person had wounded Somi, he would have murdered him immediately away, but he guessed that the person was simply trying to scare them away. He sees that the guy wasn't so insane and wonders what was so vital in the pouch that the person needed to charge at Somi with a sword. He looked inside the pouch and grinned, deciding to carry the person and saying that he would be beneficial. It was late at night, and Jang Samtae was wondering where he was, while Dan questioned whether he was awake. Dan introduced himself, and Samtae wondered why his eyes were so chilly. Dan told him that when he charged at Somi, he was going to murder him right there. However, he indicated that he had changed his mind and asked Samtae if he knew why. Samtae was horrified and stated that he had no idea. Dan claimed that everyone's life has a monetary value and inquired how much his life was worth. Samtae claimed to be worth $1 million. Dan, on the other hand, believed Samtae was merely a thief whose value should be limited to 1 silver coin. Dan noted that everyone establishes their own worth. He said that Samtae's life would be $1 million, plus another $1 million to compensate for his attempt to assassinate Somi. In the end, Dan informed Samtae that he needs to pay the sum of $5 million to live. Many female staff thanked the magistrate for his efforts, but he felt under too much pressure and that many people now viewed him differently. He was expecting this because everyone assumed he was the one who apprehended the notorious Jang Baeksan. The trouble was that the commoners were hailing him as a hero, and the government's faith in him had become far too strong after they informed him that the Golden Buddha statue had vanished from one of the imperial residences, and that it had been done by a skilled thief. They were asking for his assistance since he was able to take down Jang all by himself and that it would be a simple achievement for him. The individual asked if Hong could do it, and he said he could. Hong couldn't believe he had to go to all this bother and wondered who on earth was that foolish thief. Samtae wonders why the heavens subjected him to such a test. He couldn't believe it last night when it became $5 million instead of $1 million for his life and forgiveness. Samtae could tell Dan wasn't fooling around. He informs him that he does not have any money on him now and that he will pay it in the future. As a result, Samtae begs to be spared and declares that he would do anything Dan desired. Samtae could sense that if he angered Dan, he would be killed without hesitation, and he believed that he couldn't die here. He also claimed to be skilled at housework and cooking. As a result, Dan chooses to spare him and tells him that if he tries to escape, his debt will double. Samtae was confident that he would be able to flee after this catastrophe. As a result, it had been a week since he became a servant, and Dan had been ordering him around non-stop. He believes that if it hadn't been for the chubby child, his stolen things would not have been discovered and he would not be in the position he is in now. Samtae realized he didn't have much time and needed to recover the pouch before the black market dealer arrived at the prearranged spot, and that the pouch contained the stolen Golden Buddha statue from the imperial residence. Somi was shocked to see so much tasty food, while Dan said that everything looked pretty good and suggested that Samtae would be a better cook than a thief. Samtae inquired as to Dan's opinion of the dish, in which he claimed that it was worth 3 silver coins per month's wage. He thanked Dan for his remarks since he had found the location of the stolen items and was waiting for an opportunity to recover them and depart the area without hesitation. Dan tells Somi that no matter how hard Sun Wukong attempts to run, he is still in Buddha's grasp. However, Samtae feels that if it hadn't been for the golden headband on Sun Wukong's head, he could have easily run away from Buddha. Samtae believed himself to be the great thief who stole from an imperial mansion, something no one other had done, and that he cannot be compared to regular criminals. He remarked that if he truly intended to flee, no one could catch him. Samtae, on the other hand, pondered why he was working so hard here. It was almost time for the black market dealer to arrive at the designated spot, and if he was late, the deal would be over. Samtae declared that he is a thief who makes a solid living by selling stuff he takes and that he is not someone else's servant. Dan said that he would be out fishing with Somi today and asked him to look after the house while they were gone. Samtae recognized this as a wonderful opportunity and wondered if Dan had relaxed his guard after eating his meal for the past few days. He promised to protect and tidy up the manor. Dan informs him that if he tries to escape, his debt would be doubled, but Samtae swears that he will never oppose him. Dan stated that even if Samtae tried to flee, he would understand what it was like for Sun Wukong to be unable to flee from Buddha. Somi inquired as to why they were suddenly going fishing when she knew there was plenty of food at home. Dan stated that there was no specific reason and advised her to fish alone for a while as he needed to go elsewhere. She wonders if she only needs to stay within the circle, despite Dan's assertion that she was intelligent and that the circle was a trap formation that rendered her invisible to people or animals. Somi promises him that he will catch a lot of fish for him, and Dan says he is looking forward to it. Dan emerged behind Hong as he was becoming agitated and claiming that he was not the one who had apprehended Jang Baeksan. When Hong discovered it was him, Dan asked him if he wanted to work with him again. Samtae resolves to run from Dan. He decides to sell the Golden Buddha statue to Chuyam Mo for $2 million. He remarked that despite stealing the statue, Samtae had done a fantastic job of surviving. Chuyam, on the other hand, advises Samtae that the government has been on high alert since they recently apprehended Jang Baeksan and that he should be cautious. Samtae stated that he had clearly heard Chuyam and that if he was caught, he would not snitch on him. However, someone rushed into the room and informed them that they were being surrounded and that someone had covertly tipped them off. Samtae notifies Chuyam that he is leaving and wishes him success. As a result, Chuyam and his followers were apprehended, while Hong was startled to see the Golden Buddha statue here. Chuyam asked who had tipped him off, but Hong answered that it was none of his business. He knew Dan was correct because the statue was such an important thing that if he could reclaim it, he would not only acquire the faith of the imperial residents, but also the trust of the emperor. Dan claimed that stealing from the imperial residence was doable. Hong is perplexed as to who the hell Dan is. He recognized the case was going to be massive, and the event with Jang Baeksun would pale in comparison. Samtae was being pursued by the guards and wondered why they were being so relentless. He recognized he needed to concentrate and that if he had been caught this time, he would be interrogated without the ability to respond and then executed. He dashed to the edge of the cliff, just able to shake them off, while Dan said that he was slower than he imagined. Samtae wondered how he got here, while Dan wondered whether he had forgotten he was within the Buddha's palms. Samtae realizes he can't get caught in a situation like this and jumps down. He stated unequivocally that he would not be caught, while Dan simply smirked. Samtae thought he would be utilizing Qinggong to flee the instant he touched the ground. Dan, on the other hand, grabbed his leg and told him to climb down the edge cautiously. Samtae runs again, wondering what the hell is wrong with him. Dan was always with Samtae, no matter how far he ran. It was as if he was everywhere. Samtae was fatigued as Dan remarked that he was within his palm and that his debt had doubled because he tried to flee, and that he owed him 10 million. He did, however, indicate that the golden Buddha statue will be used to pay him off $2 million while still owing him $8 million. Dan realized he had forgotten to collect the bounty on Jang Baeksun and intended to spend the money to buy snacks for Somi, as Samtae was ready to attack him. Samtae found it vexing. Dan had been working him to the bone for exactly 3 silver coins since he was apprehended, and the money he got from Daum was from the money he stole from him. Dan complimented Samtae on his cleaning skills and offered him more gold coins because he was in a happy mood. He realized he was extremely unfortunate. He had given up on the idea of fleeing. He tried to flee several times in the last month, only to be beaten up for it. He never, ever succeeded. Samtae discovered they were out of ingredients and went shopping. He noticed Somi was following him. She hid behind a tree when he turned around. Samtae inquired why she was following him, and she just chuckled. Samtae tells her to stop pursuing him and return. He stated that if anything were to happen to her, his head would also fly. However, Somi stated that she did not want to be alone and promised to follow him close and silently. Samtae felt awful about sending her back alone, and there were many animals. As a result, he brings her and tells her to stay close to him. Somi was surprised to see an apple while being chased by boars and seeing beautiful birds. She eventually fell asleep, leaving Samtae speechless. They eventually made it to the streets. Samtae had the impression that the streets were worse than he had imagined, which was not surprising given that one of the major players, a black marker dealer, had been apprehended. He knew that Trium had been beheaded by now because he was caught with the stolen golden Buddha statue. He worries what would happen if he was found selling it. Somi was kidnapped by someone, and Samtae recognized he was destined to die today. Something felt strange, as if the person was leading him somewhere. He decides to employ Qinggong and declares that he will not be outpaced by anyone in terms of speed. He caught up with Man and told him to put Somi down immediately. The man, on the other hand, argued that if he was going to shout, he should also glance around. Samtae became aware that he was surrounded by a large crowd, and Dan wonders if the manor has always been that large. Despite living alone his entire life, he had become accustomed to a boisterous daily life. He assumed Somi followed Samtae to the streets but remarked that the streets were now in poor condition. He worries if Somi is in any danger. They were astounded by Samtae's strength and believed that the child was incredibly important. They intended to hack off her skin piece by piece in front of his eyes. Samtae reminisced when he saw Somi. 12 years ago, his sister inquired as to what he was doing. He said that he was counting the items he stole today. She couldn't believe there was so much of it, but she warned him that stealing so much would be risky. Samtae inquired as to why she was concerned. He claimed that because their parents were no longer alive, he would protect her and that she should not be concerned. She commented on how lovely the robe is, while Samtae mentioned that there was a wealthy merchant on the streets today. He took it in secret but warned her that they appeared to be horrible people. He told her she couldn't wear it for the next month or two and to wait till they were gone. However, Samtae realized that he should have hidden the clothing better. That night, his sister did not return. He looked everywhere for his sister, only to find her in a small passageway that no one uses. He suspects she found the clothing he had stashed and wore them out that night. Since then, Samtae has detested children because of their disobedience. They said that the Merchant Association's leader was executed because of the stolen items Samtae gave him. As a result, they desired to do worse to him to exact revenge for Trium. Samtae tried to stop him, but he kicked him in the face. Somi bit his hand, and the person punched her. She made the decision to defend Samtae. Samtae is curious as to what she was doing when Somi was attempting to prevent them from hurting him. One of them was prepared to kill her while Samtae advised her to flee, but she refused. Samtae began to experience visions of his younger sister and informed her to listen. Somi, on the other hand, asserted that she didn't want to because doing so would leave Samtae by himself. Dan stopped the attack as Somi realized it was Mr. Dan. He noticed that Somi had been hit and declared that they would not have an easy death today. Samtae reasoned that perhaps his sister dislikes waiting for him alone in that rundown house. He opened his eyes as Somi questioned if Mr. Slave was awake. He inquired why she did that and if she was okay. He remarked that she should not have intervened and that she should have simply fled. Somi, on the other hand, claimed that he was far more damaged than she was. Samtae attempted to remember what happened yesterday when Dan told him to bring Somi back and that if he couldn't get up, he would die here. In which Samtae fled for his life, with no memory of what happened next. Samtae warned Somi not to do it again, but Somi refuses and says she will do it again because she does not want to lose another family member. She knew Samtae would constantly want to flee, but she said she wouldn't and would strengthen herself to defend everyone. Somi tells him not to say anything like that again, and Samtae realizes he was chastised. Hong can't believe a group brawl broke out near the village. He was told that there had been a bizarre report and that all the injured people appeared to have a broken right cheek. Hong is perplexed as to who did this as Dan was going to kill someone who was pleading for mercy. Hong recognized Dan and inquired as to what he was up to. Dan claimed that those men were attempting to murder and abduct someone, and that they were remnants of the black market trading organization he had previously apprehended. As a result, Hong orders his men to arrest everyone as they wonder who Dan is. They couldn't believe Hong, who had apprehended Jang Baeksun on his own and discovered the golden Buddha statue with his psychic abilities, would be so meek in front of a street thug. Dan inquired about his knowledge of the black faction. Hong was perplexed as to how he had learned about them. Among the several groups in the Central Plains, the black faction is a group that recruits vagrants and criminals. The organization has been causing the imperial family a lot of trouble for decades because they are extremely powerful and commit a variety of crimes. Dan claimed that these individuals and the dead black market transaction were agents of the black factions, with a branch in Mount Hung. Dan indicated that they owed him something and that he would assist Hong in settling it. At Mount Hung, Yang Hyuksang, the black faction Hunan branch leader, wonders why they aren't contacting them even though someone stated they would be here soon. Yang indicated that the upper management is already upset. He also mentioned that they had put quite a lot of time and effort into the black market trader. The speaker added that they had dispatched the elite of the elites to the location and that everything was going fine. Yang intended to kill Samtae, and not only did Jang Baeksun, whom he was assisting, get arrested, but also the black market trader he preferred was killed. He wonders why it feels like everything is unraveling when Dan appears out of nowhere. Yang inquired as to his identity but was promptly beaten up. Dan advised the guards that they should arrest them as they question if Yang is from the black faction and that they couldn't believe this was occurring. Dan's eyes were drawn to the gold coins, and he remembered how hungry Somi and Samtae were, prompting him to begin plundering on Yang to buy Somi snacks. Dan informed them that he would be leaving right away. That's how Dan got the money he needed to raise Somi and Jang Samtae. 3 months later, summer arrived. Their lives had become far more lavish because of the costly artifacts Dan brought back from the black faction group. The issue is that Somi and Samtae have gained a lot of weight. To be honest, Dan was the source of the problem. He brought back a large amount of food for them without any thought. He fed them till they were full for all 3 meals every day, and this is the consequence. Dan knew that they were just ordinary individuals who were unaware of the heavenly harmonizing skill, and that if this continued, their health would be jeopardized. He informed Samtae that he would begin training him martial arts today, as well as Somi. He instructs them to go out into the streets and purchase martial arts books. However, Samtae claims that the ones sold on the street are only third-rate martial arts books. Dan stated that was why he told him to buy it because it was perfect for their level. Samtae remarked that this was the best he could come up with. Dan remembers seeing the Taiji fist and Taiji sword before. Samtae asserted that they belonged to the Wudang sect, one of the 10 great sects' main sect. Dan claimed that Wudang sect, Zheng Sambong, is an interesting name. As a result, Samtae and Somi begin to train, while Dan wonders why they are moving in such a strange manner. Samtae stated that they are following the drawing in the book. However, Dan claims that they should not follow the movement and that it's no fun that way. He asserted that there is no set way for martial arts, and that people simply create their own martial arts and record them in books because they do not want to stray from their path. He told them to move freely and that only then would they be able to forge their own path. Dan complimented Somi as she continued to train. Dan, on the other hand, had no intention of allowing Somi to pursue martial arts in the first place. He simply wanted her to be active and healthy. As a result, if Somi continues in this manner, she will revert to her previous state very soon. However, Dan noticed that they were still eating a lot. After undergoing rigorous training, they eventually returned to their original sizes. Sima-chan, the Black Faction's leader, is perplexed as to what is going on. According to the source, the Hunan branch and those who went to collect Jiang had lost contact. Sima noted that Hunan is the quietest it has ever been, with few forces getting in the way of things. It's a fantastic area for them to do business, and Jiang Baeksan was able to repress unexpected forces as he rampaged through Hunan. Sima, on the other hand, suspected that someone was behind this and was attempting to obstruct them. He was intrigued by who it was. He told them to capture and question Hong and Samtae, and that he was confident he could learn something from them. Dan was meditating as he sensed a breeze coming. He tells Samtae to wake up and make breakfast with him as he notifies Somi that it is time for breakfast. He noted that it was windy today and instructed Samtae to check on the situation in Yuyang and report back to him. Bang Chuguk, the captain of the Black Faction Wandering Wind Squad, was informed that Hong would be transferring Jiang Baeksan and his subordinates to the imperial family. She had not expected it to occur so soon, and she found it unusual that they had kept him in Yuyang for the previous 3 months. Bang suspected Hong was attempting to gather some information, but the Black Faction refused to give in so simply. Bang believed it would be a problem if Jiang was transferred to the imperial family and wondered if she should save him or kill him to eliminate all evidence. She believes that it would be a lot easier to execute those who are apprehended than to try to bring them back. All that remained was for her to deal with Jiang Samtae, Magistrate Hong, and the recluse who had caused all this havoc. Bang realized that the person that resembled the composite drawing she saw was Jiang Samtae, who was most likely to know the identity of the recluse. She attempted to pursue him, but he had already fled. Samtae told Dan that the city's aura didn't feel right and that a stalker was chasing him. Dan inquired as to what type of organization the Black Faction is. Samtae revealed that the Black Faction was founded roughly 50 years ago by an unknown person. Nobody knows who the head of the Black Factions was, but there were reports that he had a vendetta against the 10 great sects and that the Black Factions were founded by someone from the demonic cult, but these were just rumors. Dan stated that there was no specific information about them, whereas Samtae stated that the Black Faction were just some unknown groups that no one cared about, but the faction leader had a keen insight for running groups, allowing them to unexpectedly become a force that could intimidate the major sects. Dan believed that the forces would have irritated the big sects, who are always seeking stability. Samtae replied that it was correct, and that the Great Eight families had pressed the Muram alliance to join involved, and that the current Black Faction had concealed themselves to avoid being discovered. Dan recalls that the Muram alliance was set up by key persons from the orthodox sects, and that if the Black Faction was able to avoid and hide from them, he felt that the Black Faction commander must be particularly cunning. He believed that if there had been reports that a bunch of mere vagrants had established an organization during his time, they would have been crushed cruelly for no reason, as people sought to show off their strength. He recognized that, in comparison to that type of Muram, the current Muram had grown so quiet as to be dull. Samtae pondered what they should do and commented that Hong would be in a pickle, while Dan realized he had forgotten about him. Bang inquired if he was the magistrate and said that she had some questions for him. Hong recognized he had let his guard down, even though he had anticipated something would happen before transferring Jiang Baeksan, but he had not expected them to move so quickly. Hong inquiries about her question, while Bang states that while she understood what occurred to Jiang Baeksan and the black market dealer, it didn't make sense for Hong to go after the Black Faction's branch. She was certain that someone was behind this. Bang inquired about the identity of that person. Hong, on the other hand, stated that he knew nothing. He knew he'd die here, but he'd sworn to carry the secret to his grave, and as a man, he wouldn't break his word. Bang understood she had no other option but to torture him. She used the confession powder on him as Samtae recalls that Hong was someone they needed. He realized that if Hong died and he fled, Dan would have beaten him to death. He utilized his Qinggong to perform a surprise assault while seizing Hong and fleeing. They were being pursued by Bang's subordinates, while Samtae hoped to be saved. Dan unsheathed his blade while grinning. Hong regained consciousness as Samtae told him to keep his mouth shut and that they would soon lose them. He wonders who he is as Samtae introduces himself and states that he is Lord Dan's subordinate. Hong was grateful for Dan's assistance and remarked that he would not have survived without him. Samtae is aware that Dan required Hong for Somi to live a more serene life. However, they were already detected as Samtae seized Hong and fled. As Bang instructs them to attack Samtae, he realizes he has no choice except to fight. Dan effortlessly defeated all of Jang's subordinates. In the history of the Central Plains, only one martial artist has ever been dubbed martial god. Sanfeng, who became immortal after founding the Wudang sect, and the Dharma, who founded the Shaolin temple systems. Even the heavenly demon who had achieved the pinnacle of the countless demonic sword and ruled over the demonic cult was never able to gain that title. Even though they were among the greatest in their times, only the martial god remained undefeated, which is why he naturally became a legend. Samtae asks why he was so late, while Dan tells him to stay quiet. Bang inquired whether he intended to obstruct their path. Dan stated that a mound of rubbish was still trash. He told Bang that if she didn't agree with him, she should try to prove it to him. While they were witnessing Dan slay all the Black Faction's members, Hong commented that Dan is an outstanding warrior. Samtae described Dan as a monster rather than a human. Hong asks if he was disrespecting his own master, while Samtae says he would insult the emperor if no one was listening. Hong wondered how a lowly servant could insult their master, while Samtae wondered how he could say that considering he was the one who saved him. Hong wanted to flog him because he was a servant who dared to insult his master. While they were arguing, Dan told them to be quiet and that it was time to return. The following day, the government was broken into early in the morning. The incarcerated criminals had all been slain, and those who hadn't died were in a state where they were certain to die soon, and the magistrate had vanished without a trace. A search squad was created to look for the magistrate, and Yu Yang was in a frenzy. People realized it had to be the Black Faction and believed that Hong had been slain and his body deposited somewhere. However, someone remarked that he was a decent person who tried to conquer the evil Black Faction. They couldn't believe such a wonderful guy had died at the hands of the Black Faction. Hong was glancing at Somi when she noticed that an unknown gentleman was staring at her. Hong wondered if the young girl was his benefactor's daughter. He believed they looked similar and assumed she was shy. Somi introduced herself to the magistrate, as Hong tells her that he has a kid approximately her age, and he wants her to play with him when she has free time. Hong thought Somi would be ideal as a daughter-in-law while Dan stared at him. Sima was informed that the contact had been broken and that Hong had gone missing. He doubts that Bang would have failed her mission, but the servant stated that based on the intel, they couldn't search them and found nothing. Sima wonders what was the odds of them being dead while the servant stated that it would be less than 10% and that they would have completed their mission and all that's left for them to return. Sima, on the other hand, speculated that they might be murdered by that reclusive martial master. However, the servant stated that the most recent letter delivered to them contained no such information. He remarked that if the martial master exists, the magistrate's kidnapping or criminal assignment would have a good possibility of succeeding. Sima had the feeling that something had gone wrong someplace and that he didn't like how he felt. The servant assures him that they will assemble another search squad. Sima instructs him to conduct a comprehensive search throughout Huan and to select veterans for the search team. Dan instructed Samtae to protect the mansion and keep a close eye on those who were imprisoned to ensure that they would not escape, and he instructed Hong to return to Yuyang the next day and detain the constables there 3 days later. Dan explained that Tianzi Mountain is the location of the Black Faction's headquarters, which Bang Chugik mentioned. Dan stated that he would personally travel there. He informs them that they should be concerned about themselves because they are so pitiful that they can't even beat one of them. Dan advises them to strengthen themselves so that they will not be defeated at their age. Dan thought it was strange to be leaving the manor. He recalls traveling alone in locations like that when he was younger because he was so concentrated on martial arts all day. He questions why he was obsessed with strength, but he had considered this to be a form of happiness in life. Dan was questioned by some thieves about passing through and was asked for his possessions. However, he said that he had nothing on him. They felt it was silly, while everyone was preparing to jump at him. Someone, though, yelled that they should be embarrassed for bullying the weak. They had no idea who she was or why there was a woman here. She quickly defeated the bandits and stated that if it hadn't been for her, Dan would have been in huge trouble. He stayed silent while she pondered why he was staring at her face so attentively. However, she realized he was staring at her sword while Dan said her swordsmanship was amazing. She wonders if Dan was taken aback by her outstanding swordsmanship. Dan, on the other hand, was unconcerned about what she was about to say and began plundering the robbers. Dan said that the money was most likely stolen from others and that he was only collecting it up. Dan handed her a silver coin and said it was for her. She understood he was robbing them and demanded more coins, but Dan refused. She is perplexed as to how a little silver coin could be of any use, whereas Dan suspects she is affluent. Dan wondered why she wielded her blade so conceitedly. She inquired as to what he had just said, but a rush of wind blew in her face as she realized Dan had vanished. She wondered where he had gone and what the hell that was. In the Hunan province, near Tianzi Mountain, Dan was eating the ramen while everyone was staring at him. As he exited the shop, he realized why they were staring at him and that they had poisoned the food. Dan returned to the ramen shop and murdered everyone there. He had the impression that the village was odd, and that the people's eyes appeared dead, and that there was a terrible vibe in the air. He recalls Bang telling him that the Black Faction was a village itself. One of the members of the Black Faction reported they'd been ambushed. Sima wondered if the visitor had come to stir trouble. The individual indicated that there was only one adversary, but he was a very powerful martial master. Sima, on the other hand, couldn't believe what he'd just said. The member clarified that it was true, and that the martial master had already defeated 100 of them and was on his way here. Sima-chan recognized him, even if only for a split second. He wonders if he has defeated everyone on the first floor. He could see Dan was looking at him as if he were a bug. Sima was about to unsheath his blade, but he was defeated easily. Hong gives the order to arrest everyone. He said that they are the Black Faction's terrible bandits, and that this was the Black Faction's headquarters. Hong can't believe that a single man achieved what the Imperial family and the Great Murim Alliance couldn't. He was wondering who Dan was when he heard a sound behind him. Dan identified that individual as the Black Faction leader. He informed Hong that he would leave immediately because he had promised Somi that he would return early. Hong thanked Dan and said that he would look for him once he had settled everything. Dan informed him not to forget about it as Hong promised to keep quiet about this matter. However, Dan said it wasn't about that, but the bounty of those people. The people couldn't believe that the Black Faction was taken down and that the magistrate had accomplished a great feat. They wondered if Hong would be summoned to the central government at this rate. Namgung Sohai, the Murim Alliance Phoenix Squad captain, felt something was wrong. She wonders how Hong discovered them when the Murim Alliance couldn't. She also believed it was strange that Hong would lead a group of constables to take down the Black Faction's martial masters. She was certain that someone was behind this and wondered who the hell it was. The Sword Emperor and Murim leader, Namgung Chun, learned that the Black Faction had collapsed. Jae-gal Woon, his military advisor, speculated that a formidable martial master is backing with the magistrate. Chun confirmed that his estimates were true and instructed him to dispatch the captain of the Phoenix team to investigate the situation. He believed that if there was a hidden martial master, they needed to find out who it was and win them over. Sohai felt that her stomach was hurting after eating so many sweets. She added that if her grandfather saw her in this condition, he would most likely murder her. Sohai is perplexed as Somi serves her a dumpling while claiming that she is already full. Sohai recognized her as a sweet child and inquired about her name. She requested her parents to express her gratitude. Somi, on the other hand, indicated that she did not have parents, but Dan emerged and claimed to be her father. Sohai recognized him as the man from her past, and she was certain that heaven had sent him to assist her. Dan, on the other hand, ignored her and questioned why he should assist her. Somi was overjoyed when Dan revealed that he was her father. She stated that Sohai appears to be in great need and that they should assist her. Somi tries to say, "Dad," and Dan is perplexed as to why she keeps repeating it. Samtae advises Sohai to pick up the pace after she complains that the dirt isn't coming off. However, he informs her that that is not how she should do laundry and instructs her to pound it harder. Sohai inquired if he wanted to die, while Samtae said he was just trying to teach her how to do laundry and wondered why she would murder him over it. He asked her if she thought it would be easy for someone to ask for a favor, as she wondered why she had to be treated this way. Dan responded that he is unable to assist her for free. He proposed that she assist with domestic duties while she was here and that he compensates her for it. Hong handed Dan 100 gold coins. He can't believe Hong was able to obtain that much in such a short period of time. However, Hong stated that it was nothing in comparison to what he had done and informed him that the imperial residents had personally removed those people and would be turned over to the Eastern Bureau, where they would most likely perish. Dan inquired if the situation had been resolved, to which Hong replied that it had. Somi was described as a sweet and adorable child by Hong. He inquired as to whether it was time to send her to school. Dan was oblivious while Somi caught a fish. Hong emphasized that nowadays, children are required to attend school, and there is no greater disgrace for a child than not knowing how to read or write. He remarked that it would be excellent for Somi to make friends and that he knows of a great school, whereas Dan preferred to think about it first. Hong believed Dan was practically into it, as he worried how his prospective daughter-in-law might be unable to read or write. Somi noted that the magistrate's garden was full of interesting things. A child asked who she was and why she was there. Hong inquired of Jinrang as to why he was yelling at Somi. The boy recognized it was his father. Hong asked Jinrang if this was what he had taught him. He chastised his son for mistreating Somi. Jinrang apologized, as Somi said she was fine. She asked Hong whether that was the boy he was referring to. Jinrang wonders why his father treats Somi better than him. He eventually hurried away in tears, declaring that he despised his father. Dan is asking if Somi and Jinrang could be friends. She implied that they may be best friends. He asked whether she wanted to go to school, while Somi pondered if she could, as Dan says she can if she wants to. Somi claimed that she wanted to go to school. Sohai inquired if it was okay and noted that the Chunsong school is well known in Yuyang. However, Dan stated that no matter how well known it was just a school. Sohai claims that Dan has no concept how the world works, and that the more famous the school, the more difficult it is for Somi to get along with the kids. She remembers how she had to change her name on purpose to get into a school, and how there was a great fuss about it, but she managed to beat them all up. Dan assured Sohai that Somi would be fine and that if she encountered any difficulties, he would step in and assist. Sohai, on the other hand, asked Dan whether he was certain that he would not budge even in the face of greater force. She believes Dan is untrained in martial arts and that he has nothing but the manner. She wonders if Dan has a chance against a well-known family or the harassment of government officials, but realizes it has nothing to do with her. Dan stated that he would protect Somi with everything he had, even if it meant turning the world against him. Sohai felt a peculiar feeling and asked Dan about it, but he stated that he didn't sense anything. She believes that the odd energy can only be felt by a martial master like herself and that there must be a martial master nearby who can defeat the black faction. Sohai takes Somi to school the next day, as requested by Dan. Sohai informs her that she will be able to meet wonderful people, whilst Somi hopes to make friends. She tells her that if there are any evil kids, she only needs to send them flying with her punches, and Somi says she can do it. Sohai walked about the streets as some suspicious people were watching her. Somi introduced herself to the class, but no one seemed interested in her. As she walked to her seat, she realized it was Jinrang, who she knew. Sohai rushed up to Dan, declaring that she had discovered the martial master behind Magistrate Hong. She added that while she was researching, she overheard people discussing who took down the black faction. Sohai inquired about Dan's knowledge of the Hunan Five Swords, stating that she wished to bring them into the Muram Alliance but had no idea who they were. She realizes that if she informs the Muram Alliance about it, she might be able to finally say goodbye to her miserable maid life. Dan stated he'd come along because he wanted to find out who they were. Somi informs Dan that she has learned the 1000-character classic as well as calligraphy and that she has grasped a brush for the first time. Sohai informs Dan that Somi just stated what she did and nothing about her friends. However, Dan said that it was merely the first day of school. Sohai guessed it was feasible and asked him whether he still wanted to visit the Hunan Five Swords base. Dan said he'd go after putting Somi to bed. Sohai inquired if they are the Hunan Five Swords that had vanquished the black faction. They claimed, however, that they had no idea what she was talking about. She stated that the leader of the Muram Alliance wants to meet with them. They claimed that they had no idea who had leaked such information, but they declared themselves to be the ones who had subjugated the black faction. Sohai perceived their energies as those of a second-rate martial artist, and she believed she could easily handle them as well. She urged them to demonstrate their technique for subjugating the black faction. As a result, they used their technique to break the trees without even moving. They questioned if she still had doubts about their might. Sohai noticed that they broke the trees without making a sound and surmised that martial masters of this caliber would find it easy to conceal their talents. The leader told Sohai to go back if she still had any doubts. Dan was looking at the tree branches and thought they were decent. One of the servants alerted his lord of the rumors that the Hunan Five Swords were assisting the magistrate behind the scenes. The lord stated that he had never heard of them, and the servant had not either. The lord struck the servant and demanded if he had come to discuss worthless rubbish. He stated that there is a good probability that they were the ones who attacked the black faction while the servant remained silent. The lord, on the other hand, kicked the servant for ignoring his words. He realized he needed to see it for himself and notify everyone to go locate them. The servant believed that if he had the opportunity to choose his lord, he would never choose someone like him. Sohai apologized to Dan for having to go without being able to say goodbye to Somi. She intended to show the Muram Alliance the Hunan Five Swords as soon as possible. He presented her with a sack stuffed with gold coins. She could tell, though, that his irritating face looked different today. She thanked him and wished him well. Somi was unhappy that she wouldn't be able to see Sohai again, but Dan assured her that if it was fated, she would. She wishes they could live together. Dan inquired about school, to which Somi replied that it was enjoyable. He informs her that it is difficult to get along with others, but states that she will meet more people in her life. Somi assures Dan that she is his daughter and that she would not be discouraged. Dan praised her as a strong child. He could tell that Somi, at 7 years old, is more mature than her friends. While this isn't necessarily a bad thing, he doesn't think it's the greatest thing for her. He introduces himself as Dan Woohyun and said that his daughter's name is Dan Somi. He assures her that he will protect her no matter what happens and encourages her to live her life fearlessly. Somi was captivated by the name, Dan Somi, while he wondered if she understood. A group of folks on the street drew Dan's attention. He could sense the person's impressive pressure. The Lord was told that they had found the Hunan 5 swords, which were 5 kilometers north of Yuyang, and that they were on their way to Hubei. He was curious to see how strong they were as they instantly pursued them. Dan was able to listen in on their sound transmission and thought he had stumbled into something intriguing. Sohai asked if they needed to rest, but they said they could easily go for 3 days without stopping. She requested that they utilize Qinggong, but they refused. Sohai suspected them of being suspicious, but she noted that she had seen their strength. She sensed something approaching and deflected all the shuriken. The Hunan 5 swords went to hide behind Sohai as she realized that they were from the Martial Empress Fortress, an organization within the martial masters of the unorthodox sect. Sohai recognized the guy to be Tyrant Sword, Ma Dokjin, 50th rank of the Martial Emperor Fortress. She claimed it was an honor to meet the famous Ma Dokjin, while he was impressed that even the younger generations knew about him. She noticed that the guy behind Dokjin is Quan Mujin, the martial master of the swift sword style. Dokjin inquired as to whether those behind her were the Hunan 5 swords who defeated the Black faction. The Hunan 5 swords introduce themselves in trepidation as Sohai realizes she may not survive today. Ma Ilwung and his brother intended to get the Black faction leader's bounty and flee to the western areas of China a few days ago. As such, they intended to deceive the entire Murim alliance by erecting the trees, claiming that Sohai was strolling the streets by chance and that they knew exactly what she was looking for. They believe that if they succeed, they will be set for life. Ilwung believed that they had worked so hard to get here and that they would not fail in the same way that they had duped Sohai and Dokjin. Ilwung questioned how unorthodox fools could stand in their way, while Dokjin laughed and thought it was interesting. Dokjin stated that he had fled Shangxi to see them and wanted to see the abilities that had brought down the Black faction. Ilwung assured his brothers that he would handle the situation. He stated that his sword slashes everything in sight and that anyone who encounters it would perish. Dokjin tells him to bring it on already, while Ilwung asked if Dokjin doesn't value his life as much, as he used the world-breaking sword technique, where he informed his brothers to flee. Sohai was perplexed, as were Dokjin and Mujin, and declared that the Murim alliance was doomed, and that he couldn't believe that the Great Phoenix Squad captain had been duped by such morons. However, Dokjin was outraged by how they dared to squander his energy by coming here. He orders everyone to kill all of them. He informs Sohai that if she doesn't entertain him, she will be pulled apart to death. Mujin was outraged because he thought he had finally found a martial master capable of subduing Ma Dokjin, but he soon discovered they were idiots. Dan appeared and questioned if Hunan 5 sword had died, saying that it was a shame because the trick they pulled was interesting. He claimed that it had been a long time since he had seen someone fight, while Mujin backed away and inquired as to who he was. Sohai was impressed by Dokjin's ability to hold such a large sword with one hand and attack so quickly. Dokjin was disappointed at the level of the Namgung clan's sword technique, while Sohai stated that she was weak but not her clan. Dokjin claimed that the Namgung clan has become far too arrogant simply because they have created a sword emperor. He slashed his swords repeatedly till Sohai was overcome by his power and speed of attack. Dokjin explained that the Murim is a place where only the strong rules apply, and losers must keep their tongues quiet and be courteous to the victor. However, Sohai claimed that she would rather be killed, as Dokjin was about to grant her dying desire, but the attack was thwarted by a silver coin. Dan stated that she had forgotten her silver piece and inquired as to why she was still in Yuyang. He claimed that he had previously stated that Sohai conceit had covered her eyes and she hadn't been seeing reality for what it is. Dokjin assumed Dan had to be strong if he could overcome Quan Mujin, however Sohai doubted Dan's strength and assumed he didn't know martial arts. She recalls meeting him on the way to Tianzi Mountain, and how the Black faction was conquered not long after. She wonders if Dan was the one who vanquished the group. Dan informs Sohai that he would borrow her weapon for a short while. She wondered if he was attempting to battle Dokjin, while Dan stated that he would put an end to this immediately. Dan tells him to bring it on while Dokjin was enraged at him for being arrogant. Sohai informs Dan to avoid the attack as she believes that no matter how powerful Dan is, the thin sword will be unable to withstand Dokjun's huge sword. Dokjun is concerned whether Dan didn't know who he was. However, Dan stated that he knows him very well and that he was just a weakling who is overconfident. Sohai couldn't believe Dan was able to easily block Dokjun's huge sword with her sword. Dan noted that while using speed to overcome the monotonous pattern of a sword is an intriguing idea, he could tell that Dokjun was so focused on speed that he didn't put all his strength behind it. Dokjun recognized that he had begun to sense the limits of relying on the huge sword's weight one day. As a result, he concentrated solely on increasing his striking speed to overcome that barrier and swing the enormous sword like a twig. Dokjun was outraged at Dan for dismissing all his efforts and went to strike him with his sword. Dan, on the other hand, just blocked the attack with ease and remarked that he never dismissed it, explaining to Dokjun that his speed couldn't compete with him, and even his big sword wasn't powerful enough. Dan wanted to inform him of his own futility as he destroyed the mighty sword and instructs him to train for another 1,000 years before fighting him. Sohai and Mujin were startled to see Dan defeat Dokjun. He handed over the blade to Sohai, who questioned if he was the one who brought down the black faction. She wonders why he didn't tell her, as Dan said, to quit worrying about trivial matters and that there are times when one should dismiss what one sees or hears. Dan tells her that what occurred today was a godsend because she didn't die despite attempting to confront Dokjun with the swordsmanship she was so confident in. Mujin decides to follow Dan as he walks back home. Mujin stated that he desired to be at his side. While there are many strong people in the world, Mujin wonders how many of them could battle Ma Dokjun as if he were a child. He believes he has finally found the right person to take him to new heights. Dan turned down Mujin's request, even though he persisted in being at his side. However, Mujin stated that it didn't matter because he would follow Dan even if he said no. He stated that if Dan refused to accept him, he would rather die, to which Dan responded by knocking him unconscious. He states that Mujin is powerful for his age, yet he could detect malice in his eyes, as if he was staring at a prior version of himself. Those eyes that will go to any length to get to the top. Dan believes that while pride is important in a martial artist, the more hatred he has, the more dangerous he will become, and that if he can't control his emotions, Mujin will not stay long. Dan was reminded of the old Jianghu by what transpired today. Mujin was doused with water when he awoke and noticed Dokjun. He was later beaten up for being a traitor and being ungrateful as Dokjun had raised him when he was on the point of death. However, Mujin claimed that Dokjun treated him as if he were a dog. He stated that he is just a pitiful piece of shit who made a big deal because he felt inferior to him when he got more renown than him. Dokjun was angered at the way he spoke back to the Lord. However, Mujin remarked that Dokjun is not a lord, but rather some trash who is attempting to murder his subordinate, making him worse than vermin. Dokjun plans to give him the most horrible death imaginable, but Mujin manages to loosen the ropes and knock out his own subordinate. He decides to calm down knowing that Dokjun will be slow due to internal injuries. Dokjun was caught off guard when Mujin slashed his eyes and fled. His vision went blurry, but he knows he can't stop here. He convinces himself that to become the strongest, he must endure. Somi and her companions went to the street market the next day. They asked Jinrang to purchase the dumplings, which he initially denied but then agreed to purchase. Somi heard something coming from that area while her friend was buying the dumplings. Dan found it odd that Somi hadn't gone home yet, even though it was already beyond school time. He was curious what had happened to her and inquired of the shopkeeper if they had seen Somi. He stated that Somi came here with her friends to buy snacks and then went to get dumplings about 2 hours ago. He thanked the individual and thought the dumpling shop should be nearby. Dan notices Somi in tears and inquires as to what she was up to at the time. She wished for him to assist and save him. Somi and her friends debated on what to do. Even after using a variety of therapeutic plants on him, she knew he was not improving. Jinrang questioned what he had done to be so gravely harmed, while Jayak told him to get off. She wonders if they should bring the constable as the person will die if they don't, but Jinrang says it's futile even if they do because this is a conflict between martial artists and the government doesn't get involved in such matters. Somi believes the individual is like her in the past and informs them that she wishes to save him. Dan wondered if the person's name was Mujin. He questioned her why she was attempting to save him. Somi stated that Mujin appeared lonely and terrified, and that he did not wish to die. She began to cry as Dan expressed his understanding of her situation. Dan tells the kids that he will look after the man as Jinrang and Jayak help to calm Somi down. He claimed that Mujin got lucky. He questioned why she was upset as Somi pondered whether the mister might be salvaged. Dan informed her that he had done his best and that it was up to Mujin whether he would make it through. Somi hoped Mujin would survive, while Dan assured her that because she had worked so hard to care for him, he would be alright because she is a lucky child. Somi pondered what he meant, but Dan assured her not to worry. She left to continue nursing Mujin, while Samtae commented that Mujin was already half dead and worried if what he said to Somi would cause her more pain if Mujin died later. However, Dan stated that Mujin might be able to survive. In which Samtae stated that if Mujin lives, he will give Dan all his possessions. Dan inquired whether Samtae was serious about handing him all his assets if Mujin lived. Samtae wondered whether he was trying to entice him to gamble on Mujin's survival. As a result, Samtae declared that he was only joking, while Dan expressed regret. Samtae asks Dan if Mujin can survive, as he is on the point of death. Dan inquired whether he knew of the children born with great luck. He emphasized that it is extremely rare to be born with no energy and another to be born with the blessing of a star. Those born with the blessings of a star and good luck are said to live a life of misfortunes until their luck shines forth. That would mean losing their parents or nearly starving to death. However, after meeting Dan, who was born with the fate of a star, Somi's extraordinary luck began to manifest, and everything she touched was blessed by luck. A few days later, Mujin awakens and understands he has lived. Somi confirmed that he was alive, and he asked her whether she was the one who saved him. Somi said she found him, but it was her father who saved him. She was relieved to learn that Mujin was still alive and decided to inform her father and Mr. Slave. Mujin was confused as to what she meant by that. At the same time, the Murim alliance. Chun asked Sohai if she had located the individual who had brought down the Black faction. She recalls Dan's words to her and informs her grandfather that she has finally located him. Chun, on the other hand, questioned why she had returned home alone. He wonders if the individual refused to attend the Murim alliance. Sohai informed him of what Dan mentioned, which the Murim alliance must seem to be ignorant of despite knowing the truth at times. He inquired as to Dan's might, to which Sohai replied that the tyrant's sword, Ma Dokjin, was like a child to him. Chun was shocked to hear that the rank 50, tyrant's sword was like a toddler to him. Sohai also informed her grandfather that Dan had remarked her swordsmanship is conceited. He was outraged by what he said because he had handled Sohai with such care. Chun, on the other hand, was fascinated by Dan, who was able to discover information that he couldn't and speculated that it could be lies, but he thought it was interesting. Mujin assures himself that he can still accomplish it and wishes to do everything it takes to become stronger in martial arts. Dan inquired if he was awake. Mujin recognized he was the person who defeated Dokjin as Dan introduced himself. He stated that he is Somi's father and the person who saved him. Dan, on the other hand, advises him that he should thank Somi instead, because he would have perished if it weren't for her. Mujin expressed his gratitude and declared that he owed her his life. Dan inquired as to whether the wounds he sustained were the result of being beaten up by his own comrades. He remarked that the Murim is a place where anyone would do everything to live, even if it meant betraying someone. He advises him not to think too negatively of them and asks him whether he would have done the same thing in their situation. Mujin stated that he is also aware of this. Dan tells him to forget everything because his blade will be filled with hatred when his heart is. He highlighted that a weapon laden with hatred is easily broken. Mujin stated that he would keep this in mind while Dan advises him to stay here for the time being and rest. He does, however, state that he will not be lying around and playing at this place. He advises him that he must work for his stay here as Mujin thanked him. The next day, while teaching Mujin how to wash the laundry, Samtae advises him to stop since he was doing it too rapidly and that the clothing would become rags. Mujin suggested that he quit lecturing him and do some work himself, but Samtae said that his duty was to supervise him and that he was his superior after all. Samtae had been performing all the household tasks by himself since Sohai's departure, so he was relieved when a new slave arrived, but that person was terrible at handling household chores. Mujin stated that Samtae was the servant and questioned why he was required to do so. Samtae asked Mujin if he had forgotten what Dan had said and explained that he, too, is a servant and that Mujin should refer to him as senior because he was the first to arrive and that he, too, had to heed to his orders. Mujin, on the other hand, stated that he had no intention of obeying his commands and that he would only do so if he defeated him. Samtae invited him to accompany him to the rear for a moment, and Mujin stated that he isn't worried if he says it like that. Samtae flees and yells for Dan about the new person he brought and how he was disrespectful and tried to kill him. Mujin chooses to pursue him, but Samtae mocks him by saying that his Qinggong is faster than his, while Mujin says that if he is caught, he will be dead. Samtae noticed it was Magistrate Hong. He was perplexed as to why he was here, and Hong advised him to prepare to answer for his criminal actions. Hong had been working prior to this. He reasoned that now that the black faction was gone, any bandits who had been hidden must be delighted. He puzzled who it was until he discovered it was Samtae. He claimed he should have known when Samtae disparaged his own master. This time, he resolves to give him a good lesson. Samtae wondered if Hong had learned about his previous robberies and acted brazenly and ignorantly. He inquired as to what he was suddenly talking about, while Hong asserted that Samtae had been performing various offenses while hiding behind Dan. He draws his swords and declares his intention to kill Samtae, but Dan intervenes. He inquired as to the cause of the uproar, while Samtae protested as to why Hong barged in from nowhere and demanded an explanation for his actions. Samtae remarked that no one was kind or cleaner than him. Hong inquired if Samtae had anything to say after viewing the picture of him. He recognized that was his name, while Somi puzzled what was written on the paper. Hong indicated that he was involved in illegal opium trafficking and human trafficking, which made Samtae question what nonsense that was. According to Somi, Mr. Slave is not such type of person. She claimed that the guy who drew it must have sketched it incorrectly and highlighted that he was not a horrible person. However, Hong asserted that it was practically a total match with his name, whilst Somi stated that they share a name by chance. Samtae recognized Somi was protecting him and stated that he understood. Samtae stated that he would prove that he was not the one responsible for the crimes and would go find the true culprit, while Somi stated that she would work together with him. Somi, on the other hand, wondered where they were heading. Samtae realized he didn't know what to do and fled because he was angry. He knew it was a mistake to bring her along to catch the true culprit, but he couldn't leave now that Somi had put her trust in him. He could tell that the drawing resembled him and wondered if he had done all those things inadvertently. Dan inquired as to what he intended to do. Samtae mentioned going to places like gambling dens, which made Dan question if he was going with Somi. She questioned if she could go there, but Dan said she could when she was older. He tells her to go play with Mujin in Yuyang and that he will come get her later. Samtae maintained that he had never done any of those things, but Dan replied that he was aware of them and claimed that Samtae was not brave enough to commit such acts. He advises him not to worry about it. He stated that the real criminal is involved in both opium and people trafficking, and thus capturing and interrogating everyone involved in human and opium trafficking will make things easier. Samtae speculates that it could be the bandits. Dan added that the bandits have a stronghold to return to and that they will remain in one area unless the government attempts to subdue them. Dan stated that Uelu Mountain was far nicer than he had expected. He realized he should have built a house here instead, while Samtae commented that the place would be excellent with all the bandits flocking around. Dan remarked that he detected sarcasm in that sentence. Samtae exclaimed that he couldn't believe he was heading to the bandits' cave to prove his innocence and that he could perish whether he was guilty or not. He stated that he is just a third-rate martial artist, and that Dan had taught both Somi and Mujin but had completely neglected him. Samtae mentioned that everyone had a full stomach because of him, and that he sweeps the floor occasionally, watches after Somi, and handles the domestic tasks. He added that the house would be in shambles without him, and that Dan was always focused on Somi and that Mujin bastard. Dan deduced that Samtae was envious on the inside. Dan noted that because Samtae had accomplished so much during this time. He inquired if there was anything he wanted. Samtae added that he, too, wishes to grow stronger. As a result, Dan advises him to attempt to get stronger. As a hail of arrows approaches, Dan pulls Samtae back to keep him from being hit. Someone yelled that it would have been preferable if they had simply been hit by the arrows and perished. Samtae understood it was the mountain bandits and that they had outrun them. He believes that was all right because Dan was around. Samtae was perplexed as Dan stated that he was in pain and dying. Samtae was confused as to what he was doing, while Dan explained that he had been struck by an arrow and was unable to move. He inquired why he was doing such a stupid act in the middle of nowhere and told him to stop saying strange things and to do something about the matter. Dan inquired if he wanted to get stronger as Samtae realized Dan wanted him to learn by fighting for real. He notices Dan not moving an inch and concludes that he has no intention of assisting. He realized there are at least 5 of them on each side. He believes it was too much for him when he was merely a third-rate martial artist. But he promises himself that he will not give up without a fight. The chief bandit realized Samtae was fighting all of them and advised him to give up because one of his friends had already died. Samtae claimed that his sight is useless if he believes the person is dead. The chief bandit was angry by what Samtae had said, and all of them rushed at him. Samtae is aware that his Qinggong has helped him defeat stronger opponents. He knew he couldn't run away if he wanted to get stronger. The chief bandit attempted to slice him, but his blade fell to the ground. He had no idea as to where Samtae was when he came behind him and stated that his strike was slower than Dan's flick. Samtae noticed it worked and commented that he couldn't inflict much damage because he wasn't very powerful, but he stated that experience is the best instructor. He saw an impending attack and leaped up, punching the archer to the ground. Samtae thought he was doing well but was taken off guard when the arrow struck him. The chief bandit claimed that Samtae is a loser who can only use Qinggong, and he instructed everyone not to give Samtae any space for moving around. He is unsure what to do as Dan instructs him to take 2 steps to the right, in which he avoids the boss bandit's strike and goes for the uppercut. The bandits realized that their boss had lost and chose to jump as Samtae, which Dan thought was good enough and promptly annihilated the bandits. Samtae indicated that he was able to handle it, however Dan stated that without battling with his life on the line, he would never be able to overcome his fear. Samtae asked Dan if he would assist him if he died and couldn't defeat the bandits. Dan says he will not intervene and tells Samtae that if he wants to get stronger, he cannot rely on others. They decided to question the bandits' leader. Dan asked whether he knew who the person in the paper was, and the chief bandit said it had to be Samtae. Dan mentioned that he noticed his subordinate carrying opium and inquired as to where he obtained it. The chief bandit indicated that he obtained it in a back alley, while Dan stated that if he does not reveal the truth, he will suffer anguish worse than death. The chief bandit is taken aback by Dan's energy and believes he is a skilled martial artist. He indicated that it is from the Tri-Blade faction. He added that after the Black faction crumbled, all the many orthodox factions that were hidden all throughout began to rampage. On the surface, everything seemed to be calm, but behind the scenes, people were quietly working to grow their forces. Among these was the Tri-Blade faction, which was active in the Hunan area and supplied opium to the bandits. The chief bandit explained that they were strong people, and even their low-ranking members knew martial arts, but no one could see their faces because they were wearing masks. The bandit leader said he didn't want to tamper with opium either. However, those people beat up his subordinate and forced them to buy it, and as a result, many bandit strongholds have vanished. Dan inquired as to their whereabouts, to which the chief bandit said that he wasn't sure and that they used to come seeking them once a month but didn't know when they'd return. Dan realized he wasn't lying and demanded all the opium they had. Sohai believes that the rumors were true, and that the opium was not only in Yuyang, but also in numerous villages throughout Hunan. She understood there was nothing she could do as she had been bumped by someone. She recognized Mujin and Somi and wondered why the two of them were together. The individual inquired if they had located the person who had brought down the Black faction. Chu Banji, on the other hand, questioned if he was referring to Samtae. He suspected Samtae had died. Chu, on the other hand, said that someone who defeated the Black group could not be dead. The individual told him not to think about anything else except producing the drug. He stated that he would find Samtae and murder him, which was the reason they joined hands in the first place. Chu claimed that if it weren't for Samtae, he wouldn't join forces with scumbags like him, and instructed him to quickly grab Samtae and bring him here. The individual inquired if he had heard about the magistrate discovering opium while subjugating the mountain bandits. He said it wasn't guaranteed, but Hong would try to bring their opium into the imperial residence. Chu explained that they needed to get the opium right away or risk being caught. He tells him that if anyone who understands anything about medicine investigates it, it will only be a matter of time until they uncover his presence. The individual intended to rip Chu's limbs off for being noisy, but he realized Chu was still useful to him. In this regard, he declared that he would have his subordinates act. Dan was stunned as Sohai pondered how she had ended up in this circumstance. Somi made Sohai go back to the manor 30 minutes ago, and she was left wondering why she had come back. Dan inquired as to why she had returned, while Sohai was perplexed by his tone and wished to inquire about something. She questioned why Mujin was with him. Dan remarked that Mujin is a member of his family, but Sohai wondered how he could let such an unorthodox person into his family. Mujin indicated that he is no longer with the unorthodox. Dan indicated that it was now her turn to answer questions. Sohai revealed that they had discovered that person's source was in Hunan. She added that they hunted him down and discovered that the situation had deteriorated here. The residents in the tiny villages were all infatuated with opium. Even in the larger villages, many people were hooked to opium. As a result, Sohai came to Hunan to search out the guy. She stated that this was a national issue that the imperial family should handle, but a handful of the minor sects that the Muram Alliance supervises have fallen victim to opium addiction. She added that the Tri-Blade faction and their faction leader freely changed their faces. Samtae recognized that if they knew how to apply that technique, they could even modify their face to appear like him. Dan, on the other hand, remarked that he already knew that, while Samtae wondered why he wasn't told about it, to which Dan replied that he didn't feel like telling. Sohai wonders whether he knows anything about it, while Dan explains that someone is exploiting Samtae Visage to sell opium and people. Sohai inquired if Dan had any plans to apprehend that individual, to which Dan said that while he did not have all the information, he had discovered some hints. He, on the other hand, remarked that if she wants to know, he should be compensated for the information. Sohai inquired about recompense, to which Dan said that she should deliver the bounty on the black faction leader. Sohai agreed to his demands, but only on one condition. She indicated that if the situation is resolved, the Muram Alliance will accept full credit. Dan tells her to do anything she wants and says he understands she's attempting to repair the Muram Alliance's reputation. She wondered how he knew that, and whether Dan could read minds. Dan orders Samtae to bring Hong here while telling everyone that they're heading directly to the Imperial residence. Sohai questioned whether this strategy would work as Dan remarked that when someone produces something, they will always appear in some way. He stated that if they transported the opium to the Imperial residence, they would be able to identify the culprit, prompting the Tri-Faction to intervene and stop them. Sohai understood the Namgung advisor had also mentioned something along these lines. She recognizes Dan's insight and claims that he is stronger and more intelligent than she is in martial arts. She could see where he drew the line between relationships. He is cold, speaks arrogantly, and acts as if he is on top of the world, but he is quite caring towards his own family and appears to be very trusted by them. She couldn't figure out who Dan was. The enemies emerged as Hong pondered if they didn't recognize him and dared to obstruct his path. However, they said that it was not their concern. Dan advised the two of them to apprehend the man alive. They concluded they needed to catch the individual alive. In this situation, with so many opponents, Sohai believes that capturing someone alive is significantly more difficult than killing them. She realized Dan wasn't going to join the fight and concluded Mujin was the only one who could aid while hoping Samtae didn't come in their way. Mujin dashed over to them and quickly knocked them all unconscious while smirking. This irritated them as Sohai declared that she cannot lose to Mujin and highlighted that even if they cut off their limb or leg, they do not die. As a result, she fights as Samtae tells her to wait for him. Dan realized that this was sufficient enough to question them and inform everyone that they did an excellent job. Hong orders his guard to take off their mask. Everyone was astonished, and Hong wondered who ordered them to do this. However, Dan steps in and says that they won't converse if he asks such a question. Dan stated that the rumor that Hong had discovered the drugs had only been shared within Changsha. Dan clarified that their base had to be in Changsha. However, the man stated that he had no idea what he was on about. He indicated that he will not reveal anything and that he wishes to be killed immediately. Dan remarked that it was evident that they arrived after hearing rumors in Changsha, and that they are unlikely to be from the Hao clan, implying that their sect was nearby. The man decides to attack Dan, but he is easily defeated. Dan inquired whether there was a location that came to mind after hearing their chat. Sohai recognized that, based on what Dan had stated, there are 3 sects that suit that description, and they're all part of the Muram Alliance. She couldn't believe the Muram Alliance's disgrace was being exposed again, and hoped it wasn't this time. She wonders why they seem to be breaking apart. Dan replied that he would assist her again but reminded her of the cost of his assistance. As a result, they depart. The individual mentioned that his men have not returned for a long time. Chu responded that there was no way they could have failed and advised him to wait a little longer. They heard a noise and recognized it was Namgung Sohai. She had hoped Dan's estimate would be incorrect. She couldn't believe these guys could perpetrate such crimes while posing as orthodox martial artists. She recognized the person on the left is the sect leader of a minor Muram Alliance sect, and the one on the right is someone she doesn't know but looks familiar. She chooses to first deal with the people who put up the trap formation outside before questioning them. Chu concluded the person was Samtae, who was most likely in league with the guy who defeated the black faction. He announced that he had finally located Samtae. However, the sect leader stressed that they must first figure out what is going on. Chu remarked that they've already figured out what they're up to here. He assures the sect leader that they only need to murder them. He informs the sect leader that he would not support him in the future unless he kills Samtae now. As a result, he agrees to his demand. Sohai believes she must bring down anyone who threatens the Muram Alliance's reputation. However, she recognized there were too many of them and worried she might lose at this rate. In which Dan instructs her to slash at a right diagonal, which she successfully executes. She thanked him and he directed her to look over there. Sohai recognized Chu Banji. He claimed that it was not surprising that the captain of the Phoenix squad would recognize him. Dan informs Samtae that Chu utilized the face-changing technique to transform into his face. He adds that there are traces on his face that suggest he's utilized the face-shifting technique and informs Samtae that Chu's original face does resemble him quite a bit, while Samtae felt so offended. Dan orders Samtae to fight the person on the left, while he wonders why he is the one to do it. He instructs him to examine the opponent with whom he will be fighting. He stated that the individual has a strong lower body and appeared to be confident in his qinggong. Dan then commented that, aside from himself, Samtae is the fastest with qinggong and questioned if he could compete with him. In which Samtae indicated that he could do it because they were here to apprehend Chu, who impersonated him. Chu knew, after seeing Samtae being kind to him, that Dan was the one who brought down the black faction. He threatened to kill him, but Dan told him to keep quiet. Chu claimed that Dan took away his place, slaughtered his family, and stole everything from him. Dan realized it had been a long time since he'd seen the crimson wind that only he could see. The crimson wind signifies those who cause calamities and those who injure their surroundings while harboring bad intentions. Dan didn't want to start any disastrous relationships and then questioned if this was his destiny. He tells Chu to quiet up while Chu declares that he will crush everything Dan values. Dan recognized that words would not reach him as a lightning strike appeared and annihilated Chu. Everyone was perplexed, and everything happened far too quickly. They wondered as to who he was, while Dan noted that everything had finally quieted down. Sohai remarked that she has witnessed numerous deaths but none as heinous as this. She could see with her own two eyes that no one had touched them, but they were unable to put themselves because of the terror instilled in them. Their energy flows were flipped inside out, and their internal energy flowed in reverse, causing their meridians to burst as they died. She believed that due to Chu Banji's medicine, they ought to be much stronger. Dan informs Sohai that he will leave the rest to her. The mystery hunter, Sa Gukjung, was ascending a cliff in northern Hunan, near Dantang Lake. He added that the location was totally off-limits for people 1,000 years ago, but he came here since it was lately permitted to visit. In which he later collapses inside the mountain. He was able to restore consciousness and uncover something. He wonders if those were the traces of the mythical Imugi. He said that this was fantastic and that if he gave this knowledge to the Muram Alliance, he wouldn't have to worry about money for the rest of his life. Later, Gukjung came upon more bodies and wondered whether they were expecting someone. He noticed a person's name inscribed on the ancestral tablet, as well as some writing on the wall. It was claimed to pay homage to Dan Woohyun, the martial god. Somi remarked how warm the weather was as Mujin and Samtae were working on the farm. Sohai asked why they needed to work on such hot days and suggested that they pay someone to do it. However, Samtae stated that Dan asked them to do this, whilst Mujin encourages her to help them instead of just sitting there. Sohai tells Somi to rest, but she says she's well and that her father wanted them to work. Sohai wonders if Dan was attempting to train everyone, but believes that it was too harsh on Somi, who is still so young. Dan commented that even Somi works and that Sohai is worse than a toddler. Dan wanted to place a wager and see who could cultivate the fastest. He explained that the wager would be 1 silver coin. Sohai began doing the work as they learned how easily she was duped by Dan. At the same time, Chun was informed in the Muram Alliance that the mystery hunter had uncovered the martial god's secret cavern on Gentleman Island. He was also told that the bodies of the 3 skies had been located there. The 3 skies, that title was well known among all martial artists. The 3 people with the most sway over the Muram. The 3 skies were given their names since no one else could attain their levels. Chun recognized this was no little story, and that it would tremble the entire center plane. Hyo Gong, a Wudang sect elder, announced that they would also visit the location. Chun understood they needed to go because it was the Wudang sect's Tae Gongjing's body. Zhang Sanfeng, the founder of the Wudang sect, invented the Taiji fist. Tae Gongjing, on the other hand, is the one who assisted Sanfeng in understanding martial arts fundamentals. As a result, Sanfeng was able to meet Gongjing by chance through the 3-element sword formation and understand Taoist ideas to build the modern Wudang sect's martial arts. As a result, it was logical for the present Taoist within the Wudang sect to respect Tae Gongjing. Gong stated that because the corpse of the renowned martial artist of the heavenly demon divine cult, Cheon Mugwang, is also present, the demonic cult will make their move as well. War will erupt between the orthodox and demonic forces if one wrong step is taken. Chun stated that given the gravity of the situation, he chose to dispatch 200 martial masters from the alliance. He added that the Wudang sect would command them and that Tae Gongjing's corpse would be returned to the Wudang sect. He also seeks their assistance in investigating the martial god's secret cavern. He assumed that the bodies of Tae Gongjin and Cheon Mugwang would be cared for by the Wudang sect and the demonic cult, respectively. However, something bothered him as he wondered who the hell Nam Juri Eon was. He believes she is one of the three skies, but none of her accomplishments are known throughout the world in comparison to the other two. Samtae was convinced that plowing the ground on such a scorching day would kill him. He desired to jump into the lake, while Sohai commented that the water at Dongting Lake is incredible. Samtae remarked that it is too deep and could kill him if he fell in, but Sohai encouraged him to give it a shot first. She speculated that Samtae would live because his lips appear thick enough to float, whereas Mujin orders them to stop fighting and stand up, which incensed both. Sohai questioned why she had to cultivate this property, while Samtae answered that eating what they grow is cheaper than buying from outside sources. However, Sohai suspected there was a reason for this. She claimed Dan possessed such high-level martial arts skills, while Samtae suspected Dan used to fight for a living. However, Somi indicated that Dan is a carpenter who repaired the house and constructed most of the items within. Sohai couldn't believe Dan was so strong despite only being a carpenter. Mujin thought it was silly, while Somi said that he also made the hoe. Dan advised them to cease prying into other people's pasts and inquired if they were aware of what was going on in Yuyang, which had recently become quite boisterous. Sohai said she wasn't sure, and Mujin questioned whether it was due of the incident with the Triblade faction. Somi mentioned that her friends were discussing it at school and that they had discovered something. Dan inquired as to what it was, and Somi instructed him to guess. A special pigeon messenger arrived while Sohai informs everyone that she must return to the Muram Alliance. Samtae sensed something was wrong and wondered what it was. Dan advises him to investigate. Sohai had heard of the legend of the martial god, but she had not anticipated the discovery of the secret cavern and the three skies corpses. Mujin was taken aback by what Samtae stated, but he informs them that it was confirmed by Hong as well. Mujin recognized that this wasn't going to be a simple matter. He is aware that the legendary martial god is also known as the ultimate divine demon. No one knows whether he still exists after 1,000 years or if the legends were made up. Mujin stated that they needed to get going and that if the martial god existed, they could be able to receive some good stuff, while Samtae stated that this was a perfect opportunity for them. Somi mentioned that she had heard of it as well and wondered what a martial god's secret cavern was. Dan inquired as to where they claimed it was located. There were many rumors about the martial god, and he who had killed countless individuals in the Central Plain. He was not only skilled in martial arts, but he was also famed for being unkillable and capable of surviving in any situation. However, it was later revealed that he was killed by the 8 immortals. Mujin thinks what could be more fascinating for a martial artist. They claimed it was on Gentleman Island. Dan replied that it was too far and that they would not be going. Mujin indicated that they would arrive quickly and that they should arrive before the Muram Alliance or anyone else. However, Dan stated that even if they get there, there will be nothing for them to obtain because nothing remains in that location. Mujin wondered how he knew it and wondered if he knew the place well. He theorized if Dan, a typical carpenter, grew strong after encountering the martial god. Dan, on the other hand, indicated that whatever he was thinking was incorrect. Dan remembers the Imugi being on Gentleman Island 1,000 years ago. He vaguely remembered countless odd things that no one could have imagined, and the 1,000-year Imugi was on the island. There were numerous deadly herbs and insects all around, and animals that are often seen would be several times their normal size due to the spiritual power that the Imugi emanated. He went there when he was 15 and stayed until he was 35. He had been defeated numerous times and endured so many near-death experiences that it became amusing, but he had survived in the end. The only thing that remains is the trace of his training that he left on the cliff, but he had no intention of returning merely to view that. Samtae revealed that the Muram Alliance leader is heading to the Gentleman Island from Hunan. He described the island as a rare opportunity paradise. Noted that neither of them has adequate control over their current talents and questioned how they would use their new skills. He tells them to quit babbling and start training. He added that if they are lucky, their rare opportunity may be closer than they believe. Samtae noted that even if it wasn't for the rare opportunity, he wanted to look at it while they could. Dan was perplexed as to what he was on about. Samtae then revealed that he was referring to the bodies of the three skies. He explained that there are 3 old corpses believed to be the three skies, as well as an ancestral tablet that appears to revere the martial god in that location. Dan informs them that he has changed his mind and that they must prepare to travel to Gentleman Island. Hong realized Dan wanted to go, but he pondered why he had to accompany him. Samtae announced that they had arrived at Gentleman Island. Sohai is puzzled as to why they are here. Dan remarked that he was intrigued by the three skies corpses. He realized they hadn't started dealing with the corpses yet, while Sohai stated that the entrances and exits used by the mystery hunter had all fallen and that they couldn't go in. Dan wished to see the mystery hunter, but Sohai informed him that he was no longer alive. She had no idea who had murdered him, but his limb had been severed. Dan concluded that because he was the first to discover and might have grabbed something, he assumed the hunter became the target of many others, while Samte noticed that the environment was quieter than expected. Sohai stated that it was the sacred site of the martial god, and since the corpses of the three skies were there, no one would want to raise a commotion here. Dan thought the name was wonderful, however Sohai believes the martial god does not exist. Sohai added that there was another story in which the 8 immortals appeared, and he perished while attempting to flee from them. Dan started to laugh, which Sohai had never seen him do before. She wonders if the story about the martial god was really that interesting. Dan commented that stories are often exaggerated, therefore it's rather interesting. He inquired as to why she was here, to which Sohai replied that she was simply checking to see if there were any strange people around. She said that the negotiations between the Muram Alliance and the demonic cult had concluded, and that they would no longer have to battle each other. Someone announced that they had discovered the secret cavern's entrance. Sohai chooses to go first, while Samte states that the demonic cult and the Muram Alliance are the only ones who can enter and wonders what they should do. Dan tells them to stay put and monitor the situation. Samte pondered what he was going to do next. Dan responded by saying he was going to take a nap because he was exhausted from being on the ship for so long. Dan wondered if the voice that announced they had discovered the entrance had come from the west. He began to reminisce on his earlier training days. He recognized 1,000 years had passed. Dan leaps down the cliff and discovers that the trap structure has remained unchanged for 1,000 years. He enters and notices that new cuts have been made in the wall so that no one can recognize it. He remarked that it had been a while and that, even though it had been 1,000 years, he should have been at their side and that he was now in the living world while they had already gone to the afterlife. Dan recalls that the three skies had respected his power since they were young, and they were people who frequently battled whenever they met. He recognized the joy it was to be addressed as master. Dan viewed them all as disciples and friends. Samte was bored and wondered where Dan had gone to nap. They are wondering if that was Mujin and why he came here. Mujin advises Samte not to relax his guard and expresses his surprise that he will receive looks from others. He tells Mujin that due to his fame, even Hong has turned to stone. As Samte and Hong argue as usual, Mujin wonders what that is and states that tens of ships equipped with cannons are going this way. Hong claimed that it is impossible and that weaponry such as cannons cannot be obtained without the authorization of the imperial family. Mujin, on the other hand, stated to be serious and to have strong eyesight. Samte inquired if they had heard the dreadful sound and suspected that the ships were directing their cannons at them. Hong stated that they are adept at cracking jokes and instructed them to quit teasing him. Hong remarked that even if they possessed cannons, firing them so openly would be serious treason, and they could be executed for it. The cannon then fired, striking the top of the mountain as they were astonished and decided to flee. Mujin pondered if they were from the unorthodox side and guessed that they must have spent a long time looking for the martial god's secret lair. He recognized that the first elder would be the one who put forth the greatest effort, but he wasn't sure. Sohai recognized the hostile attack and knew why the demonic cult was concerned. She believes this occurred when they were close to the entrance and determines that all they need to do now is protect this location well. Sohai advised them to gather their power and deal with their adversaries first. The Muram Alliance's Hunan branch leader agreed with her decision and indicated that they should first block external attacks. The Seven Swords of the Wudang sect leader Go Damjin stated that the Wudang sect is a member of the Muram Alliance. He added that while he would like to see their ancestors' corpse right away, it is more important for them to take care of people who set fire to this precious area. As a result, they start dealing with them. Samte and Mujin proceeded to fight, while Hong hoped they would win and wondered when Dan would return. They realized the cannonball was coming from above them. Damjin manages to obliterate it and questions them as to whether they are the ones who triggered the havoc and who they are. The intruders indicated that there was no use in talking and that everyone should murder them. Because everyone had gone to halt the ambush, and just a handful had stayed to guard the entrance to the secret grotto. The masked assailants were moving quickly and had slain those who were protecting the entry. They had the impression that the cave was taking longer than intended, but they soon understood that the air flow had shifted. They noticed someone and inquired about him. Dan then realized he had several unexpected visitors. Dan was displeased that they were the first to arrive at the location. He did, however, praise them for coming and informed them that he would get rid of them for generating such a commotion before. Dan could tell they were quite steady in their sword stances, as though he was gazing at assassins from the past. Dan commented that they appear to be strong, but that coming here was a mistake. The assassins were prepared to assassinate him. Dan stated that it was a wonderful formation, possibly even better than the Shaolin. They could tell by Dan's energy that he is a martial master, but they believed that with their formation, they could take on a supreme peak martial master because those who have been trapped in this formation have never survived. As the assassin was about to assassinate Dan, he kills one of them instead. The assassin understood that one of them had already been killed in an instant with such a mysterious movement, but declared that there was an opening and charged towards Dan. He wondered if they wanted to die together and chastised them for being dumb. He claimed that if they had used their wits a bit more, they would have been able to survive for much longer. Dan found it interesting as he defeated them. He argued that simply because they have internal energy does not make them invincible. He chooses to teach them how to wield a dagger. The assassin questioned his identity as Dan killed him with his dagger. He recognized it was a signal flare that came out from the assassin. He summarizes that an unknown force ambushed the Orthodox Demonic Alliance on Gentleman Island, and they're attempting to get their hands on what's within the secret cavern while distracting them. As so, the assassins intended to fire a signal flare for those who ambushed the island to retreat, thereby alerting the others that they had achieved their goal. Dan noticed that things were becoming better for him. Sohai wondered what the sound was and where they were heading. Gu Huang, the demonic cult, recognized they had ceased attacking and retreated. Damjin had no idea who had brought those forces here and couldn't discover who had sent them, and those they had captured alive had all committed suicide by eating a poison pill. Someone claimed to have heard a loud noise just before they retreated, as if to warn them of something. Damjin advises everyone that it was a signal flare and that they should proceed to the secret cavern. Sohai noticed that the martial god's secret cavern was completely vacant. Damjin voiced his belief that such a simple ploy had fooled them. Huang replied that this is not the time to act like this and advised that they pursue them immediately. They told Sohai to stay put while they pursued the assassins. Sohai discovered she had been left behind by herself and claimed that things had not been going well recently. Something caught her eye, and she realized it was an ancestral tablet bearing the name Dan Woohyun. Chun was informed that they had no idea who the attackers were or who had taken the bodies of the 3 corpses. He couldn't believe that not only was Gongjin's corpse gone, but they had found no signs, or anything left behind by the martial god, and had gained nothing from this. He had put in a lot of effort and money, only to have it all go wrong in the end. Jae-gal revealed that the unorthodox factions were not behind the attack this time because they had been tracking their movements from the start. As such, he claimed that it could be an unknown or outsiders. Chun, on the other hand, suggested that it could have been from a demonic cult. They were taken aback by what he stated and questioned whether it was a scheme of the demonic cult. Chun stated that he was only speculating and that they shouldn't believe everything they see on the surface and should keep the possibility open. Jae-gal stated that he hadn't considered that since they discussed how to go with this matter with the demonic cult and that he will investigate the demonic cult as well. Namgung Chun is a member of the Namgung clan, which is reputed to be the most powerful of the 8 great clans. He is regarded as one of the most powerful figures on the Central Plain as the Sword Emperor. It is stated that no one can equal his outstanding brains and foresight. Jae-gal was relieved that Chun was the alliance leader, but lamented the fact that his term was ending. He feels that if someone fresh is elected, the Murim alliance will be in disarray. Chun remarked that the sword markings were useless and that it appeared as if someone added sword marks to the wall to conceal prior traces, and that it is hard to get any further from here. Chun thought he might be able to uncover something valuable for the limitations he was experiencing with his sword techniques and questioned who on earth had robbed him of this opportunity. Samtae was perplexed as to why Dan had summoned them to such a remote location. Mujin wondered the same thing and inquired as to what he was doing. Samtae said he is currently training and that true men have strong lower bodies. Samtae believes Dan intends to teach them even more powerful martial arts, but Mujin advises him to quit being ridiculous. They were curious, though, if Dan would be able to access the martial god's secret cavern and obtain anything beneficial for them. Dan realized they were already there and apologized for keeping them waiting. He told them to unzip the bag as Samtae was overjoyed and thought something huge had appeared. However, it was only 2 shovels. They were perplexed as to what these were for, but Dan instructed them to begin digging. They questioned if Dan was serious when he told them to dig with all their might. When they were through digging, Dan commented that it wasn't too bad and that they both had talent for shoveling. He instructs Samtae to bring whatever is hidden in the bush here carefully. Samtae claims there is nothing there, but Dan tells him to put his hand out. He noticed a trap formation and was astonished to find 3 skeleton corpses. Dan advises them to bury them respectfully. Sohai took note of the ancestral tablet, which the hunter claimed he saw when he initially discovered the secret cavern. The three skies honor the martial god, and Dan Woohyun's name is written on the tablet. She questioned if it was the Dan but hypothesized that two people with the same name may exist. Chun inquired as to what she was thinking so profoundly about. He's curious if it's related to what happened on Gentleman Island. Sohai stated that something was bothering her. She inquired as to whether people could live for 1,000 years. Chun laughed and stated that it was an intriguing concern. He stated that Emperor Qin had expended so much effort in attempting to create the potion of immortality, but he was ultimately unable to avoid death. However, he stated that while all humans die, there are some exceptions that arise once in a blue moon. Sohai wondered if he was alluding to the 8 immortals. In which he stated that she was correct and that the 8 immortals who became immortals had long defended the center plane Murim. He stated that it was essentially a legend with no credibility to their stories, but that it is feasible for someone to live for 1,000 years if they reach that level. Sohai guessed her thoughts weren't that crazy. She thinks Dan is quite strong, but she wonders how he could be the martial god, who is the strongest in the history of the central plane Murim, and she says that the powerful have always had an air of class and an exceptional spirit, just like her grandfather. She claimed that there is no way a strange man who takes money from bandits could be on the same level as the 8 immortals. Chun inquired if he had resolved her worry, as Sohai thanked him. He mentioned that it had been a long time since he had spent time with her and invited her to accompany him to Dongting Lake. Dan added that the three skies enjoyed drinking the most when they were still living. He stated that he never expected to be pouring wine for them in this manner. Samtae requested that a cup be offered, and Dan obliged. He believes he should do this because Dan's back looks particularly lonely today. Samtae wonders if the wine is pricey because it smells wonderful, while Dan questioned if he was allowed to drink. Samtae insisted that those bodies were the three skies, but Dan claimed that they only had the same names and that he had misread it. Samtae wondered if Dan was trying to tell him he's a fool who can't even read, and Dan said that he might have been born that way. Samtae inquired as to how he obtained the corpses, but Dan answered that they are not the same corpses. Mujin recognized that Samtae should stop asking and that the situation would be volatile. Somi requested that Mr. Slave locate her ball, while Samtae said that he still has questions for Dan. However, he made the decision to get her ball as soon as possible. Dan wonders if they ever had a ball and says that lying is bad, but there are times when white lies are necessary, while Somi tells him she understands what he means. Somi was intrigued by Sohai's hasty departure and wondered what she'd been up to since then. He remarked that he was unsure but feels that the Murim alliance must be enraged because they received nothing. He mentioned that Sohai would be occupied for a while and then realized that they had visitors at this hour. Somi was astonished by Sohai while Dan recognized that they had a special visitor. Chun appreciated Dan for thinking of him as significant. Dan commented that he expected the Murim alliance to be quite busy right now but stated that they might have plenty of time on their hands. Chun added that he was already in his old age and that he would not accept a job that did not provide this much free time. Dan asserted that it was interesting for him to chuckle even after experiencing something like that, while Chun was curious about what he meant and wanted to know more. Chun mentioned Dan as an unusual acquaintance of hers and wondered if he truly defeated the Black faction. Sohai remarked that Dan did not acknowledge anything, but she was positive that he brought down the Black faction. Chun remarked that Dan is a strange man who he knew from the moment he first met his eyes, and that he is an extraordinary person. Somi was excited to finally see Sohai, but Dan said it would be tough right now because she hadn't come alone. Mujin conveyed his concerns and indicated that the Sword Emperor was present. He also mentioned that Chun is the current Murim Alliance leader. He emphasized that the 5 emperors, including the Sword Emperor, are unbeatable on the battlefield and are no different than death gods. Dan could tell Chun's energy was distinct from those of the other martial artists he had encountered thus far. However, that is all there is to him, and he hasn't been able to fully grasp the martial arts he has. Mujin wondered if they had come here because of what had transpired on Gentleman's Island. Dan doubted that and thought they'd been too quiet for it. However, he added that whatever the case may be, he thinks this is fate. Dan was curious if Chun liked fishing. Chun noted that as a child, he would grab a fishing rod and fish all day without becoming tired of it. He remarked that he couldn't recall the last time he was allowed to fish in peace. Chun realized he had almost no such quiet periods aside from when he was young and immature. Chun took up his sword in order not to lose to the other growing martial artist in their 20s, and he did so for the sake of extending the name of his clan. He continued to grow up in this manner, eventually arriving where he is now, but looking back, he didn't have anything left. He stated that he needed to advance to the top position in the orthodox side to improve his clan's reputation, but he found that nothing he achieved was what he desired. Somi rushed over to tell them she had caught another one. Dan compliments her on a job well done and advises her to attempt capturing a bigger one the next time. Somi said she'd capture something much bigger and share it with everyone. Chun wondered where this void was coming from, but he felt Dan resembled him and was worried that he would make the same mistakes as him, but he realized he was mistaken. In the past, his children wished him happy birthday. However, Chun advises them that if they have the time, they should just train with swords instead. He emphasized that weak people are useless. He believes that, in comparison to him, who wanted only strength, money, and fame, Dan discovered something larger and better. He realized it was all in vain. Dan claims that the more he attempts to break through the wall, the more difficult it becomes. He added that in such situations, he needed to focus on his surroundings rather than the wall, which he was confident would be beneficial. Chun recognized it and mentioned that Dan was a genuinely interesting person, to which Dan responded by thanking him for thinking of him in such a way. Sohai dashed in and informed her grandfather that there was a problem. She added that advisor Jae-gal had been attacked by unknown assailants and was on the verge of death. Chun instructs her to get ready as they are going back to the branch right soon. Dan could feel a faint energy of death encircling Chun, but one shouldn't believe in energy alone. Dan advised Chun to be mindful of pride and arrogance and to remember that a martial artist could die at any time. Chun thanked him for his advice but added that he had no plans to die easily. He lamented the fact that he had to go with such short notice. He expressed gratitude to Dan for providing him with a comfortable spot to rest. Dan tells him that if he's still alive, he can come back whenever he wants. Mujin was curious as to what had happened to them because they appeared completely pale as they collected their belongings and went. Dan responded that he didn't know either, but that it was highly urgent, but that it had nothing to do with them. Mujin added that there are speculations that a Muram sect has appeared in Yuyang. He stated that things had been a little disturbing in both Yuyang and Hunan. However, Dan maintained that he didn't know since he was too preoccupied with Somi. Mujin revealed that certain people had emerged in Yuyang, claiming to help administer the city. He believes they are considering returning to Gentleman Island to see whether there is anything beneficial there. Dan thought it was a pain in ass, and he feels that if sects or clans arose, they would start making fuss in other areas. He had appreciated the Dongting Lake in Yuyang since the hamlet itself is relatively tranquil and martial artists do not cause disturbance, making it a suitable area to raise children. Dan remarked that flies had begun to congregate, while Samte stated that Yuyang belonged to them. Dan, on the other hand, assures them that they do weigh on his mind, but that they are only rumors for the time being and that they should simply wait and see. Samte and Mujin thought they weren't an actual martial clan, but they believe the Hunan Dan clan are the ones who have protected and governed over Yuyang. The pigeon messenger delivered a message in which it stated that they are pursuing the party that ambushed the advisor and are currently moving towards Anyang, where they are already engaged in a few rounds of fighting. Chun felt their adversaries were formidable and informed her to return to the branch to check on Jae-gal. Sohai asked if he would be okay being alone, while Chun wondered if she was worried about him because he was old. She requests him to teach them a lesson as she returns to the branch to check on the advisor. Sohai inquired at the Muram Alliance branch about advisor Jae-gal, and the servant replied that he was at the main building. Jae-gal inquired about Chun and why she was painting so intensely. Sohai wondered if he was normal, and he wondered if she was hoping he'd break a bone or something. She explained that they had been told that he had been ambushed and was on the verge of death, while Jae-gal questioned what she was on about. Something didn't feel quite right to Chun. He indicated that it was an urgent messenger pigeon, but he saw no traces of the Muram Alliance on the trail heading to the location written in the letter. A rope tripped his horse as an arrow was about to strike him, in which he managed to avoid the attack and remarked that he had grown old and voiced his surprise that he had fallen for such a bad ploy. He wondered whether if this is energy-dissipating poison. He became certain of it as he couldn't gather any energy. It's a poison that saps a martial artist's energy and can be lethal in the long run, and it's claimed to be extremely difficult to obtain. He was able to avoid the following arrows, but he realized he couldn't recover his energies and was later struck by the arrows. A voice commented on how impressive it was that the Sword Emperor refused to succumb even after his energy had been depleted. Chun recognized the voice and realized he couldn't see clearly, and his vision was fuzzy. The voice said that today was the day that this location would become the Sword Emperor's burial. Chun feels they had meticulously planned this, and that he was their target from the start. Chun indicated that he will not die easy, and that if he died here, the Muram Alliance would certainly fall apart. Dan was wondering if Somi might appreciate a boat cruise on Dongting Lake. He figures he'll need a boat then. Sohai and Jae-gal set out to find Chun. She knew they had purposefully duped her grandfather into being alone. Jae-gal knew that these were traces of battle and that something had happened here. Sohai encourages herself to stay cool and not make any quick decisions, and she believes that her grandfather cannot lose. Jae-gal stated that there are traces of explosives, and it is difficult for anyone who is not a member of the imperial family to obtain them. He discovered further traces and deduced that it was an energy-dissipating toxin. Sohai recalls that it is a poison that is particularly lethal for martial artists, and the recipe is said to have been lost for a long time. She flees quickly in search of her grandfather. Samtae informs Somi that he spent 2 days doing all of that while she insists on wanting to help. He added that he needed to give her a solid scolding this time, and that she kept attempting to help, but he wondered what she accomplished in the end. Somi wondered if Samtae was going to chastise her. Samtae recognized that disputing with her would be futile and opted to focus on finishing up, while Somi wanted to assist as well. Dan questioned why he was raising his voice towards Somi. Samtae explained that she kept getting in their way and that the boat was almost finished. Dan commented that it looked nice for something that only took 2 days to construct. Samtae was pleased to be acknowledged and wondered if he was more gifted than he realized. Mujin, on the other hand, noted that this was only feasible because he concentrated on it several times more than when he skipped sleep to do martial arts. Dan told them to start going right now. He was struck by the soothing wind and the seemingly limitless horizon of the Dongting Lake. He wonders if this is what life is all about. Dan believes that it isn't a bad thing for a martial artist to wield a sword, but because he had spilt so much blood, he didn't realize how valuable such freedom is. Somi tells him to look over there while Dan stated that the scenery is beautiful as Somi said that boat rides are so fun. They felt that they had knocked on something. Dan thought that they should meet again if he doesn't die but didn't expect to meet Namgung Chun again like this. Jae-gal was informed that they can't find any more traces at all. He knows that there are a lot of people that are after Chun, which goes for the unorthodox and demonic groups, and that there are even some orthodox groups that would benefit if they got rid of him. He expressed disbelief that they can't find anything for 1.5 months. Moyong Hakmun, the sword saint of the world's second strongest clan, revealed that what happened on Gentleman's Island was leaked to the world, and the Muram alliance is being derided. Hakmun added that they are dealing with an assassination attempt and have their hands full. He wondered if they would announce that the alliance leader had gone missing after being attacked by an unknown assailant. Hakmun stated that the Namgung clan has already dispatched reinforcements for Chun, and that settling the alliance's situation is the main priority right now. Jae-gal realized that for the time being, they needed to trust the Namgung clan. He indicated that he wanted to set everything aside and search for Chun, but he decided to return to the alliance first. Sohai's father inquired as to what she was doing at such an odd hour. Sohai asked if her grandfather was still alive, but he answered that his father isn't the kind to die easily. Sohai recognized her father was correct, and she stated that she would do anything to find her grandfather. That concludes Season 1 of Chronicles of the Martial Gods Return.